For nearly 1,000 years, in what is today southwestern France and northern Spain, there existed a category of people considered unclean and cursed, despised, and deeply discriminated against. They were originally known as Christians, and from the 16th century onward as Cagots, with variants such as Cagots, Cagots, Cagots in Spain, and other regional names. Cagots are documented as a distinct social group as early as the 11th century. Although they were not different from the majority population in religion, they were also Catholic, nor did they speak a separate language or display unusual physical traits. They lived in dispersed communities found throughout towns and villages in the region. It is estimated that a third of settlements in southwestern France and northern Spain, even the larger ones, housed Cagot communities. Forced into isolation, Cagots were compelled to live in separate quarters called cagoteries, usually located at village margins. Considered impure, they were forbidden to approach common water sources or food supplies for fear of contaminating others. Consequently, they were prohibited from using public wells, entering mills, farming land, or selling food. Throughout history, Cagots were forced to wear a distinctive sign, typically in the shape of a goose or duck foot, cut from red cloth and stitched onto their clothing. A decree of the Bordeaux Parliament forbade Cagots, under punishment of whipping, from appearing in public dressed in anything other than red clothes and footwear. In 1460, in some villages, stricter measures were proposed. Cagots were forbidden from walking barefoot in the streets, a common practice among the poor, under penalty of having their souls pierced with a red-hot iron rod. Being born into a Cagot family determined one's social status for life, with no real possibility of upward mobility or integration. Discrimination began in the earliest days of life. At a Cagot child's baptism, church bells were not rung as usual for other infants. The ceremony took place at night, in silence and with discretion, as though it were shameful. Discrimination against Cagots persisted even after death. They were buried in separate cemeteries, located far from those of the rest of the population. Rare attempts by ecclesiastical authorities to permit burial in common cemeteries triggered violent revolts. Although Cagots were Catholic like their neighbors, the church did not defend them from prejudice. On the contrary, it reinforced it. In many parishes, they were allowed to enter churches only through a side door, often deliberately built low so that they had to bend when entering. An enforced gesture intended to remind them of their inferior place in society. Inside the church, Cagots had to slip in quietly and gather in marginal areas, in the worst seats available. They were forbidden from using the common holy water. Instead, they had a separate basin reserved for them. Touching the shared basins was strictly prohibited. One extreme case from Brittany tells that a Cagot who dared touch the common holy water had his hand cut off and nailed to the church door as a warning to others. During services, Cagots were separated from other worshippers by a railing. In some cases, they were even barred from receiving sacraments altogether. If they did receive communion, it was offered on the end of a wooden spoon, symbolizing the impurity they were presumed to carry. Marriage rules were equally strict and humiliating. Cagots were permitted to marry only among themselves, because any family accepting a mixed marriage would be irrevocably tainted in the eyes of the community. Before the law, Cagots had profoundly unequal status. A Cagot's testimony was only considered if no other evidence existed, and even then, authorities required 4, or in some jurisdictions 7, Cagots to equal the legal weight of a single ordinary witness. They were prohibited from being priests, holding public office, receiving titles, or earning honors. They were strictly forbidden from participating in the political or administrative life of the region. In wartime, they could not serve as combat soldiers, though they were tolerated in auxiliary roles, especially as carpenters or woodworkers, useful trades during sieges. Even the tools they were allowed to use were regulated. They were forbidden from carrying weapons or any iron tools except those absolutely necessary for their trade. This restriction was intended to keep them controlled and to prevent revolt or defense. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that iron or wood could not transmit disease. Therefore, many Cagots worked as carpenters, woodcutters, coopers, or blacksmiths. trades that varied by region. They could practice one trade in one area and another elsewhere. Cagots excelled at woodworking and participated in constructing many buildings, some now recognized as historical monuments. Most earned their living honestly and well. For instance, in 1555, Jean d'Arnal, referring to regulations for Bordeaux, described them as carpenters and good workers who make their living by this craft in the town and elsewhere. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Cagots were commonly called masters or carpenters, considered skilled artisans. Cagots were long the target of prejudice. They were attributed supposed abnormal traits, missing earlobes, webbed hands or feet, goiter, some associated with diseases like leprosy. Bizarre myths circulated, such as bleeding from the navel on Good Friday. They were accused of witchcraft, greed, and treachery, viewed as being evil by nature, a typical demonization of marginalized minorities. What was the actual origin of the Cagots? To this day, no definitive answer exists, but multiple theories have been proposed over time. Some theories derive from phonetic similarities between Cagot and Goth, suggesting a Gothic origin. One popular interpretation holds that Cagot comes from CAA's, dog and local dialect, plus Got, meaning Gothic dog, a derogatory label. Another hypothesis suggests a derivation from chasseur, hunter plus Got, i.e. hunter of Goths, implying descent from Muslims who conquered the Visigothic kingdom. Another theory posits that the term Cagot comes from the Latin cacodeus, false god, indicating Alan origin. Alans were an Arian Christian people deemed heretics. According to this view, the hostility toward Cagots was inherited from ancient religious condemnation. However, all these theories face a major issue. The term Cagot appears only in the 16th century and exists in many regional variants. Consequently, they are considered historically unlikely. Another hypothesis suggests Cagots descended from early Christian converts living in pagan surroundings. Because of this, they elicited hostility from neighbors. Even after those neighbors converted later, the resentment persisted across generations. A theory common among Cagots themselves, especially in a 1514 petition to the Pope, claims descent from the Cathars, a persecuted heretical sect of the Middle Ages. In canon law of the time, heresy was thought not to persist indefinitely. Sincere conversion over several generations erased the stain. Thus, the Cagots' claim served as a plea for rehabilitation. The most coherent and supported theory is that Cagots descended from communities of lepers. Leprosy, known as Hansen's disease today, was seen in the Middle Ages as a divine punishment, and those afflicted were isolated in separate colonies and stigmatized. There are numerous parallels between treatment of lepers and Cagots: separate living, societal exclusion, bans on many activities. In certain regions, Cagots were effectively conflated with lepers, and some Cagot communities seem to have originated on former leper colonies. Even if they no longer suffered from the disease, the stigma remained, sometimes for generations. This explains their association with illness, forced quarantine, and restriction to crafts such as carpentry or woodworking, occupations that eventually gained them a reputation as skilled artisans, especially in later periods. Another interesting hypothesis suggests Cagots descended from a declining medieval carpenter guild. This would explain a common feature among Cagots in France and Spain: severe restrictions on profession. The red palmate foot symbol they sometimes wore may have been an ancient sign of the guild. This guild may have thrived during the pilgrim traffic boom on the Camino de Santiago, 9th–10th centuries. But once traffic declined, its members remained isolated in compact communities. Still, this theory does not fully explain their disease association or strict quarantine measures compared to other marginalized groups in Europe. Over the centuries, Cagots persistently fought for their rights, sending numerous petitions and appeals to religious and secular authorities. A notable example from 1514, the Cagots of Navarre petitioned Pope Leo X, denouncing systematic discrimination in Catholic churches. The Pope responded favorably, issuing a papal bull ordering that the Cagots be treated with kindness and on equal footing with other faithful. Despite later backing from Emperor Charles V in 1524, who demanded enforcement of this equality, local authorities and populations resisted. The result was endless legal battles, and Cagot segregation in churches continued in some regions well into the 18th century. Century after century, Cagots continued appealing to higher authorities to end discrimination. Although their requests were often seen as reasonable and officially approved, enforcement was thwarted by local hostility, so social exclusion persisted. Gradually, however, discrimination began to ease. In 1768 in France, a symbolic first occurred. A Cagot was ordained as a priest, a significant gesture of recognition and integration. The most sweeping change came with the French Revolution, with its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. After the Revolution, Cagots finally became full citizens, with rights equal to those of others. In 1809, the sub-prefect of Argelès replied to the Minister of the Interior, who was concerned about the fate of this outcast population. The Cagot population has melted and mixed so much by intermarriage with other communities of the country that any physical or moral characteristics, if they ever existed, have completely disappeared, and these families differ only by an old local tradition whose memory is fading day by day. In Spain, segregation was officially abolished in 1819, when Parliament expressly banned legal marginalization of Cagots. Nevertheless, prejudice persisted for long afterward in mentalities and daily practice. Despite integration over the 19th and 20th centuries, discrimination persisted in attenuated forms as Cagots gradually blended with the majority population. Today, no significant Cagot communities identify themselves as such, but it is believed that almost every family in southern France and northern Spain has at least one Cagot ancestor. The term Cagot still occasionally serves as an insult in the region, though many people no longer know its origin. In the end, Cagots were accepted one way or another into their surrounding communities. They brought neither curses nor plagues. We may only imagine how they viewed their own situation. Did they truly see themselves as inferior and corrupt as they were told? Or did they feel deep down that their discrimination was absurd and unjust? Perhaps some looked on others with hatred and dreamed of revenge. Perhaps others hoped, in painful innocence, to prove they were human just like everyone else. Although their lives were undoubtedly harsh and humiliating, they still had something essential: each other. And sometimes, belonging to a group, even one despised by others, is enough to endure any hardship. We know almost nothing about Cagot culture, if it existed at all. Few traces survived. Their descendants, understandably, wanted to leave behind that painful legacy. All that remains now is a dark stain in the region's history and a sobering lesson about how prejudice and intergenerational hatred can destroy lives, destinies, and entire communities. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. If you agree, tap like. And if you want more thoughtful explorations like this one, subscribe and hit the bell to stay informed. Which theory do you think best explains the origin of the Cagots? Share your thoughts in the comments below.